welcome to the most expensive laxative planet in the universe. Here, every grain of yellow sand is stained with human blood. In the intestines of every sandworm lies an imperial dream. The planet Arrakis isn't a vacation resort. The air here can squeeze out the last drop of water. In the bone marrow, sandstorms can tear apart mecha warships. And what's more deadly than the sandstorms are those living meat grinders that lie dormant underground, stretching up to 400 meters in length. Humans have gone crazy in the pursuit of the spice, ultimate cosmic drug. It can enable you to foresee the future, and it can also turn you into a walking corpse. When the prophecy of the savior and power conspiracies clash in the yellow sand, do you think these golden worm excrement crystals can give birth to the most magnificent interstellar tyrant in history? Are you ready to plunge into this bloody heavy metal dream of interstellar politics? At this moment, amidst the swirling yellow sand, three giant sandworms surge forward side by side. Their target is directly the enemy forces. Their bodies are as massive as mountains, and their huge mouths are like abysses. Ordinary people would surely flee in terror upon seeing them. But the Fremen aren't afraid at all. They nimbly climb onto the backs of the sandworms, and turn them into fast war mounts. Charging towards the greedy spice-mining colonizers and foreign troops, all the creatures in the path of the sandworms are devoured. The various great houses are locked in a fierce dispute over this. Can Paul avenge and protect those he loves in the whirlpool of power? What kind of disaster will be triggered by the appearance of the sandworms? Let's step into the legend of the Dune universe together. According to the records in the Imperial log, in the standard year 10191, the Battle of Arrakis broke out. The Harkonnen launched a surprise attack at night without any warning. Overnight, the Atreides family suffered a catastrophic disaster. The next morning, the corpses of the members of the Atreides family were dragged to the square in batches and burned. The emperor, who was far away in the imperial capital, remained silent about this matter. Although the Duke of the Atreides family was once like his own son, in order to stabilize his power, the emperor reluctantly acquiesced in the evil deeds of the Harkonnen on Arrakis. The Baron Harkonnen then passed on his title to his eldest nephew, Rabban. Everyone saluted the new baronet in unison. At the same time, Paul, the leader of the rebel army, was still in his dream. In his dream, he saw his unborn sister. He poured out the recent changes to his sister. He was confused about the future. Suddenly, a gunshot broke the tranquility. Paul woke up from his dream on a start. His companion Chani beside him motioned for him to be quiet. Then she quickly directed the Fremen to run towards a small hill nearby. This Freeman named Stilgar told Paul and his mother to hide where they were. He said they would take care of the rest. The Harkonnen team was approaching in their direction. Paul hurriedly pulled his mother and hid under a rock. The Harkonnen were especially vigilant in the dangerous desert. They soon noticed the footprints on the ground. Just as one of them approached the hiding place of Paul and his mother with a weapon in hand, there came the rhythmic sound of a sandhammer knocking from a distance. The Harkonnen immediately realized that the Fremen were summoning the Lord of the Desert, so they rushed towards the rock formation and used tools and leaped lightly onto the top of the rock. Then they smashed the sandhammer and searched vigilantly for the traces of the Fremen. However, they fell right into the Fremen's trap. The Fremen deliberately lured the Harkonnen to the commanding height, making them an obvious target. The snipers lying in ambush behind the sand dunes fired resolutely. The Harkonnen on the top of the rock fell one after another. A corpse fell from the sky and startled Paul, but he quickly composed himself. He picked up the weapon on the ground and fought with the remaining Harkonnen. Only the sound of sword blades clashing could be heard in the desert. Finally, Paul knocked down his opponent with his excellent swordsmanship, but as soon as he turned around, he found a Harkonnen aiming a gun at him. At a critical moment, his mother, Jessica, picked up a stone on the ground and threw it at the Harkonnen. Paul guessed that the Harkonnen team's deep penetration into the desert might be targeting him, but Stilgar thought their purpose was to find the Fremen's underground city, trying to completely wipe out the Fremen, and then completely control the desert. After that, the Fremen used water extractors to draw the water from the Harkonnen corpses. Although this water couldn't be drunk, it could be used in the cooling system. After doing all this, they placed a sandhammer on the ground. With the rhythmic knocking of the sandhammer, the entire desert trembled violently. A moment later, a huge sandworm emerged from the ground. It devoured the Harkonnen corpses completely. The successive heavy blows made Baronet Rabban furious, but his subordinates attributed all the blame to the harsh desert environment. This completely enraged Rabban. He grabbed that subordinate and slammed his head against the console. On the other side, under Stilgar's leadership, Paul finally reached the hiding place of the Fremen. There are millions of Fremen hidden in the huge underground city. Regarding the arrival of Paul and his mother, these two outsiders, the Fremen showed strong dissatisfaction, shouting that the murderer of Jaime should be executed on the spot. But for some reason, everyone seemed to be influenced by a mysterious force. Suddenly, they shouted the title of the savior at Paul. At this time, Stilgar was attending an internal meeting of the Fremen. He guaranteed with his own life, insisting that Paul was the savior in the legend, because after Paul consumed the spice, he saw a vision of the future. In the vision, the Fremen knelt and worshipped the portrait of his father. Obviously, Paul thought that his father should be the savior in the legend, and the reason why Paul could see the future was that the Fremen had lived on the planet Arrakis for a long time. Their culture and life were closely linked to the spice. After consuming the spice, a few people with exceptional talents might be able to activate the ability of precognition. Paul was one of them. This was also the reason why he could foresee the future scenes. At this time, Stilgar came out and took Jessica away, entering the interior of the underground city. Jessica witnessed the way the Fremen dealt with the corpses of their clansmen. They used a water extractor to drain the water from Jaime's body, put it into a water storage bag, and then pour it into a pool in the underground city. Stilgar explained that the Fremen would rather die of thirst than drink the water here, because every drop of water here carried the souls of their clansmen. Now only the savior can save them, and make the planet Arrakis a green paradise again. The scene in front of her shocked Jessica greatly. She asked Stilgar why he had brought her to see this. Stilgar said that because Jessica was an important member of the Bene Gesserit, and the Fremen's own Reverend Mother was about to die, so they hoped that she could become the new Reverend Mother. Seeing that Stilgar was so convinced that Paul was the savior, Jessica finally agreed to his proposal. Immediately after, under the gaze of everyone, Jessica walked into the cave where the Reverend Mother lived. The Reverend Mother slowly opened her eyes, reached out and gently stroked Jessica's cheek. Then, she motioned to her subordinates to bring a bottle of the water of life and handed it to Jessica, telling her that drinking it could liberate her mind, but it might also cause her to bleed from all her orifices and die. Upon hearing that the water of life would endanger her life, Jessica felt resistant, until the Reverend Mother used her voice control ability to order her to drink it. Jessica then drank the water of life in one gulp. The next second, her body began to tremble violently. The water of life took effect in her body. The intense stinging pain made her suffer greatly. After struggling for a while, Jessica fainted. Outside the cave, Paul was pacing back and forth anxiously. At this time, Stilgar came out. He comforted him not to worry too much. At this moment, they could only pray for Jessica's safety. Not long after, Jessica woke up and she inherited the memories of her ancestors. She became the new Reverend Mother of the Fremen. Stilgar's voice carried more weight. He publicized everywhere that all the prophecies were about to come true, insisting that Paul was the savior in the legend. However, only Chani knew that this was just a false prophecy, spread by the Bene Gesserit in advance. The water of life had no threat at all. Naturally, Jessica would be fine after drinking it. Facing the argument between the two groups of people, Paul quickly stepped forward to explain, saying that his mother had received special training and could dissolve the toxins in the water of life. So he wasn't the savior that everyone said he was. He came here just to learn the way to survive in the desert, and to avenge the culprit who destroyed his family. But Paul's words were regarded by Stilgar as words of modesty. This instead made Stilgar more certain that Paul was the savior written in the book. Jessica hoped that Paul would also drink the water of life, thinking that in this way, everything would be revealed. But Paul knew very well that the water of life was a hoax, so he chose to remain silent in response to his mother's words. In order to prove to everyone that Paul was the savior, Stilgar asked him to go deep into the desert alone. Chani understood that this was undoubtedly sending Paul to his death, so she took the initiative to follow, and taught him how to glide by herself. The two glided freely in the dim desert. Chani took this opportunity to teach Paul the survival skills of the Fremen. Paul looked at the girl, who had appeared in his dreams countless times in front of him. He was in a trance and stared intently at Chani. Chani noticed his gaze and turned her head away shyly. At this moment, the sister who had been baptized by the water of life and her mother discussed how to make the Fremen believe in the prophecy. The younger sister thought that they should start with those who have weak wills. Looking at the Fremen beside her, Jessica got an idea in her mind. At the same time, Paul also began to try riding the Lord of the Desert for the first time. He knew deeply that if he wanted to master the way of surviving in the desert, he had to learn to ride this huge creature first. So, under the gaze of everyone, Paul resolutely walked up to a hill. He picked up the sand on the ground and struck the ground forcefully. After confirming everything was okay, he inserted the sandhammer into it, with the rhythmic tapping of the sandhammer. In the distance, a sandworm stirred up a sky full of sand, and rushed rapidly towards this direction. At this moment, everyone was worried about Paul, because no one had ever successfully ridden such a huge sandworm before. What's more, Paul had no experience. However, Paul showed no fear in the face of this giant. He stood up, threw aside the grappling hook, and got ready to ride. But the sandworm rushed past him with a howl. Paul was unwilling to give up and ran desperately on the sand dune. He understood that he only had this one chance to prove himself. Then, he leaped with all his might and landed on the back of the sandworm. The surroundings were instantly shrouded in sand. In a panic, Paul put on goggles and held the grappling rope tightly, because the slightest carelessness would cost him his life. After countless attempts, Paul's second grappling rope finally hooked onto the scales of the sandworm. the intense pain also made the sandworm slow down gradually. Paul took this opportunity to try to stand up. Finally, in front of everyone's witness, Paul successfully conquered the sandworm. In the surging sand, the sandworm was like a huge dragon, and Paul was like a heroic dragon-riding knight, galloping freely among the sand, sea and clouds. Seeing that Paul was safe and sound, Cheney finally let out a sigh of relief. At night, everyone sat around together to celebrate Paul's official becoming a member of the Fremen. Paul said that he would cooperate with them to drive all the invaders out of the planet Arrakis and make this place return to the hands of the Fremen. Upon hearing these words, everyone fell into deep thought. They had been fighting against the Harkonnen for decades, but achieved nothing. Paul told them that his family had been fighting against the Harkonnen for centuries, and he knew their habits and ways of thinking very well. As long as everyone believed in him, he would surely be able to lead them to victory. Stilgar suggested giving Paul a new name. Everyone unanimously agreed to bestow the name Wadib. It implied that Paul would become the mainstay of the Fremen. The next morning, everyone hid under the sand with the help of breathing tubes. When the Harkonnen spice collection vehicle approached, everyone emerged from the ground, catching the Harkonnen off guard. The Harkonnen were cut down to the ground by the Fremen. Before they could react, the helicopter in the air discovered Paul and his group, and started firing the machine gun wildly. Paul quickly told everyone to hide under the collection vehicle. Everyone quickly crawled to the other side under the vehicle. Cheney picked up the rocket launcher, and was about to aim at the helicopter in the sky. A Harkonnen suddenly appeared and discovered them. Paul quickly stood up and knocked him down. He took out a missile and put it into Cheney's rocket launcher. When he turned around, he saw two more Harkonnen walking towards them. Paul immediately rushed up and grappled with them. However, one of them bypassed Paul and walked straight towards Cheney. Paul shouted loudly for Cheney to watch out behind her. Cheney turned around, she fired a shot and blew the Harkonnen away. Then she asked Paul to reload for her immediately. Just then, the helicopter flew above them. Cheney fired a shot, but it was blocked by the helicopter's shield. Paul told Cheney that the shield would only be turned off when the helicopter was firing. After saying that, he ran out of the cover, using himself as bait to attract the attention of the helicopter. The helicopter pilot turned on the shield and fired wildly at Paul. Paul leaped with all his might and jumped behind the nearby cover. When the pilot came to his senses, but at this time, a missile had already been fired at him. But it was too late to turn on the shield. The helicopter exploded in midair. The Fremen lying in ambush on the side took the opportunity to fire two missiles. With the sounds of violent explosions, the Harkonnen and their spice vehicle turned into ashes. The news that Paul had successfully conquered the sandworm soon reached Jessica's ears. Upon hearing that Paul had ridden a giant sandworm that had never been seen before, Jessica immediately gave an order to spread this matter to every tribe. She was determined to let everyone know that the prophecy in the book had already come true, and her son Paul was the chosen one in the legend. As time passed, the relationship between Paul and Cheney heated up rapidly. During their daily interactions, on this day, the two sat side by side on the sand dune, looking out at the vast and boundless desert. There was full of tenderness in Cheney's eyes. She said that whenever the sun set, the planet Arrakis was especially beautiful. Paul couldn't help but fall into memories, slowly describing his hometown Caladan to Cheney. Caladan was completely different from here. It was a planet completely covered by the ocean. The two snuggled up to each other and dreamed of a good future life. However, the track of fate was far from as smooth as they had expected. At the same time, the Baron Harkonnen also learned that his army had been repeatedly attacked in the desert. He ordered his subordinate Rabban to eliminate all the Fremen at all costs, and Paul saw a terrifying vision in his dream. A brutal holy war broke out somewhere in the south. Hundreds and thousands of people died because of him. Paul woke up from the nightmare. Cheney saw his terrified expression and quickly soothed him softly, guessing that perhaps it was Paul's long-term exposure to the spice that led to these visions. In order to further convince everyone that her son was the chosen one, Jessica decided to go to the south alone. After all, in the prophecy, the Savior was born in the south. But Paul knew in his heart that once he went to the south, the dream was likely to come true, so he firmly refused his mother's proposal. But Jessica firmly believed that Paul would set foot on this land sooner or later. Looking at his mother's departing back, the familiar figure in the dream emerged in Paul's mind. It turned out that the figure was his mother. On the other side, Rabban summoned all the Harkonnen warriors and went deep into the desert, firing missiles wildly at the rock formation in front. He had lost his mind now. He was eager to prove himself to his uncle. However, his recklessness soon made him pay a heavy price. The Fremen hidden in the thick fog caught Rabban and his group off guard. Seeing that the situation wasn't good, Rabban had to order a retreat. Paul led the Fremen to pursue the victory, launching a fierce attack on the Harkonnen. Rabban finally managed to escape onto the plain. Just when he let out a sigh of relief, he didn't notice that a Freeman had quietly followed up. The two had a fierce fight on the landing gear. Rabban almost fell off the plane. At a critical moment, a Harkonnen took action in time to save the baronet's life, and the emperor, who was far away in the empire, also heard the news that the savior had appeared in the world. Princess Irulan suggested that her father adopt a wait-and-see attitude. Then she found the Reverend Mother Mohiam of the Bene Gesserit to discuss the countermeasures. During the conversation, Princess Irulan suddenly thought that perhaps Paul was behind all of this, but as soon as she mentioned Paul's name, the Reverend Mother Mohiam quickly interrupted her. The Reverend Mother Mohiam knew very well that if other great houses learned of this, a great war affecting the entire galaxy would be inevitable. After all, Rabban hadn't been their only hope from the very beginning. The Baron's youngest nephew, Rautha, was more likely to become the new master of Arrakis. The brutal Rautha kept a group of man-eating villains. He would randomly execute a few people every day, and feed their livers to them. Today was the day when Rautha took over as the Baronet. Under the gaze of millions of Harkonnen, the Baron Harkonnen slowly drifted out in a wheelchair. The Lady Margot of the Bene Gesserit also appeared in the arena. As the arena gates slowly opened, Rautha strode out. The guards released 3 Atriites to fight with Rautha. However, these Atriites had been drugged in advance. He easily knocked down one of them. Then he walked up to the second one and cut his throat with a knife. When it came to the third opponent, Rautha noticed that this person hadn't been drugged. Obviously, the Baron wanted to test his true strength in this way, so Rautha resolutely took off the shield around his waist and grappled with this Atriites. After a fierce struggle, Rautha was obviously at a disadvantage. If it hadn't been for the guards on the side coming to his aid, he would probably have lost his life already. Finally, Rautha won the match by unfair means, and regarding this farce arranged by his uncle, he was full of dissatisfaction in his heart. The Baron explained that he had done this to let Rautha win the support of more people. This morning, he was just a playboy, and now he had already become a great hero in the hearts of the Harkonnen. The Baron then said that he planned to hand over all the spice mining business to Rabban, and promised that as long as he worked hard, he would surely help him ascend to the throne. At night, Rautha met Lady Margot in the corridor. Lady Margot came on behalf of the Bene Gesserit to discuss the breeding plan with him. Everyone saluted the new baronet one after another. After that, Rautha assembled all the Harkonnen troops and armed them fully, and marched towards the habitat of the Fremen, and Paul and his group knew nothing about this. They were lying in ambush in the desert, quietly waiting for the appearance of the spice collection vehicle. As soon as the spice collection vehicle entered the range, the Fremen immediately engaged in a fierce battle with the guards on the spice collection vehicle. Seeing that their spice collection vehicle was about to be destroyed by the artillery fire, a guard drew his long sword and prepared to fight against the Fremen, but after walking only a few steps, he was pinned to the ground by Paul. Paul took a closer look. It turned out to be his master, Gurney Halleck. It turned out that Gurney had been lucky enough to survive that massacre, having witnessed the brutal killing of his two masters. He was so disheartened that he had to engage in the smuggling business. When he learned that Paul and the others currently had only 200 people, Gurney was very shocked. He knew very well that the number of Fremen was as many as millions. If they could all follow Paul's command, Paul would have a chance to avenge his family. However, Paul didn't want to use the Fremen's admiration to rule them. He understood in his heart that once he went to the south, billions of lives would be destroyed. All the planets in the galaxy would be littered with corpses. Everyone would die because of him. Chani felt uneasy about Gurney's arrival. She was worried that Gurney would lead Paul astray. Gurney told Paul, if he didn't want to go to the south, he would tell him the location of his father's atomic bomb base. After returning to the tent, Paul promised Chani that he wouldn't use power to win this war. The next day, under Gurney's guidance, Paul came to his father's armory. He opened the dusty door with the genes of the Atriites family. The scene in front of him shocked him greatly. There were tens of thousands of atomic bombs displayed in the armory. At the same time, Jessica had successfully arrived in the south. She instructed the person in charge of collecting the water of life to prepare a bottle and wait for her son's arrival. Then people led the sandworm into the pool. The next moment, a mysterious blue liquid slowly flowed out from the body of the sandworm. This was the legendary water of life. On the other side, Paul once again foresaw the terrifying vision of the future in his dream. Chani was engulfed by the raging fire and her face was damaged. He woke up from the dream with a start, and rushed out of the tent in a panic, shouting Chani's name everywhere in the camp. At this time, Chani was standing on the top of the sand dune, looking at the underground city being bombed mercilessly by the Harkonnen with a sorrowful expression. At the same time, Rabban was very angry because Rautha had taken away his title. He was so indignant that he wanted to go up and argue, but he was kicked to the ground by Rautha. In desperation, he could only humbly kiss Rautha's foot to show his loyalty. After this battle, the Fremen suffered heavy losses. Tens of thousands of their clansmen became homeless. Just then, news came from the south. Someone called on all the tribal leaders to go to the south for a meeting, including Paul, who was regarded as the chosen one. Paul knew in his heart that he had nowhere to hide. This time, no matter how reluctant he was, he had to face the cruel reality. Paul knew very well that if he didn't go to the south, the Fremen would face destruction. But if he went to the south, His mother was very likely to start a war in his name. Facing this dilemma, he squatted down in pain, trying to seek guidance from the spirit of Jaime's, because in his previous dreams, Jaime's always appeared in the image of a teacher, giving him a lot of guidance. In a trance, he heard Jaime's voice telling him to drink the water of life to open his mind. Only in this way could he save the person he loved. So under Stilgar's guidance, Paul and his group mounted the sandworms and headed towards the south. Paul drank the water of life in one gulp. With mixed feelings, the next second, his sister's voice rang in his ear. All the mysteries seemed to have answers. At this moment, Paul seemed to be reborn. He felt that he had understood everything. He wouldn't allow anyone to question his decision, firmly believing that what he had done was the only correct choice. When he gave the order to besiege the city and massacre the Sardaukar Legion, he eventually became the kind of person he had always been most afraid of becoming, a monster. Caught up in power and fate, looking back on Paul's life, those prophecies that seemed irresistible were actually carefully woven tracks. For the people who were deeply in suffering, this wasn't real hope but a lie that had been repeatedly instilled. After Paul drank the water of life, his life was in danger. Everyone knew that only Chani's precious tears, like an oasis in the desert, could save his life. Chani knew in her heart that all of this might be part of the so-called prophecy, but her love for Paul made her feed her tears into Paul's mouth. Without hesitation, she deeply loved the sincere and brave Paul in the past. However, after Paul woke up, Chani was first delighted and then filled with worry. Then she angrily slapped him. It turned out that Paul had long expected that Chani would come to save him, so he drank the water of life regardless of everything. At this moment, Chani realized that she had lost the Paul she once knew. After being reborn, Paul obtained even more powerful abilities. He could understand both the past and the present, and connect time and space, and thus foresaw the only way to defeat the Emperor. He frankly told everyone, in countless possible futures, they were almost doomed to failure. Only one method might enable them to barely win, that was to send a challenge to the Emperor to lure him here, and then use political means to drive him off the throne. After the Emperor received the challenge, after careful consideration, he decided to meet Paul. He knew very well that the Harkonnen family held the evidence of his killing the Atreides family in the past. Once the Harkonnen family joined hands with Paul, he would surely lose all his power. This time, he not only had to confront Paul directly, but also had to find a way to warn the Harkonnen family not to act rashly. Paul finally put on the ring symbolizing power. The Fremen who were bewitched by the prophecy followed him one after another. Jessica found Chani, hoping that she could also follow Paul, but Chani had already seen through the essence of those so-called prophecies. They were just tools used by the Bene Gesserit to brainwash and enslave the thoughts of the Fremen. She always remembered that the original intention of her fighting was for the freedom and rights of her clansmen, rather than starting an imperial war that would cause countless people to lose their lives. For a certain prince's revenge, after the Emperor arrived on the planet Arrakis, the Baron immediately sensed that the situation wasn't good. He quickly asked Rautha to notify the other great houses to prevent any unexpected situations. At this time, Paul was observing the Harkonnens' base from a distance and assigning combat tasks to everyone. He noticed that Chani's attitude towards him was becoming more and more distant, but with the Great War approaching, he could only choose to remain silent for the time being. The Emperor asked the Baron if he knew about the savior of the Fremen. The Baron looked disdainful. He didn't take those desert rats seriously at all. After a conversation, the Emperor found that the Baron knew nothing about the current situation of Arrakis. Before the Baron could continue to explain, the Sardaukar soldier behind him resolutely cut off his life support device. On the other side, Paul directed everyone to evenly insert the sandhammers on each small hill. With his order, Gurney controlled the launching device and fired the atomic bomb towards the mountains beside the Harkonnens' base. The Sardaukar soldiers waiting outside fled in panic in all directions. The entire base was also swaying precariously in the violent vibration. The Emperor never expected that Paul would adopt such a surprise fighting method. When the thick smoke gradually dissipated, the Sardaukar soldiers quickly raised their military flags, trying to continue to be on high alert according to the established formation. However, a giant sandworm emerged from the thick smoke. The Sardaukar soldiers, who had just been in an orderly formation, were instantly terrified out of their wits. They threw away their helmets and armor, and rushed towards the base behind them. But how could the Fremen who were riding the sandworms let them go so easily? The Fremen controlled the sandworms and surrounded them from all directions. The helicopter overhead tried to stop them, but it was too late. Millions of Fremen leaped out of the sand, engaging in a fierce battle with the oncoming Sardaukar soldiers. The Fremen, who had been taking the spice for a long time, had physical qualities far beyond those of ordinary people. Their individual combat ability even overwhelmed the Sardaukar Legion. coupled with their geographical advantage. The Sardaukar soldiers were completely unable to fight back, under the siege of so many Fremen. For a time, the battlefield was strewn with corpses and flowing with blood. Inside the base, everyone was trembling with fear. The Sardaukar soldiers formed a line and walked towards the gate, trying to organize a resistance. However, there was soon no sound. In the thick smoke, Paul walked steadily into the base holding a golden-toothed dagger. With a cold gaze, he walked straight up to the Baron. He coldly greeted, "Hello, grandfather." Then he stabbed the dagger into the Baron's neck without hesitation. In this way, the Baron died in front of everyone's eyes. Paul finally avenged his father with his own hands as he had wished. He immediately ordered the Fremen to kill all the Sardaukar soldiers. At this moment, he had to admit that he had eventually become the monster that he had once been afraid of. After a day and a night of fierce fighting, the Harkonnen army was on the verge of collapse. Gurney, filled with deep hatred, tried his best to kill the remaining Harkonnen soldiers. Finally, he caught Rabban, who was fleeing, and killed him with a single blow. The Fremen piled up the Harkonnen corpses in the square and burned them. It was just the same as when the Atreides had suffered such a fate in the past. It was really lamentable. After the war, all the great houses gathered on the planet Arrakis. Paul asked Gurney to bring the Emperor. He walked up to Chani and told her earnestly that he had done all this to protect her. For now, Chani just needed to know that he had always loved her. The Emperor also walked in at this time. Paul asked Gurney to give an order to all the great houses. If they dared to launch an attack on him, he would destroy all the spice and make the entire empire return to the primitive age completely. Facing Paul's rogue tactic of mutual destruction, all the great houses didn't dare to act rashly. Paul forced the Emperor to abdicate by using the fact that the Emperor had plotted against his family. Princess Irulan saw through Paul's thoughts. She immediately agreed to his request for a marriage alliance, on the condition that he must spare her father. The crafty Emperor had to give in the face of the powerful Paul. He also lamented that Paul was much stronger than his father. Upon hearing that Paul was going to marry someone else, Chani was filled with shock and disappointment. The once kind lover had now become unpredictable, and the Fremen, after fighting bravely, had only exchanged it for a new imperial rule, and fallen into deeper slavery. Rautha represented the Emperor and dueled with Paul. At the beginning, Paul launched a fierce attack. Rautha could hardly resist, but Rautha then resorted to trickery. He knocked down Paul and taunted him in front of Chani. Paul stood up in pain and fought again, but was stabbed by Rautha. At a critical moment, Paul pretended to be hit. Taking advantage of Rautha's carelessness, he stabbed the dagger into his abdomen and successfully counter-killed him. Everyone knelt down and paid homage to the new monarch. Only Chani stood proudly and refused to submit. Accompanied by many Fremen stepping onto the spaceships, heading for the galaxy, an inevitable holy war thus began. At the end of the story, Chani walked into the desert alone, used the sand hammer to summon the sandworm, and embarked on the journey back home. Her back in the desert was lonely but firm. Chani would continue to explore her own sand dunes on the sandworm. The movie ends here. This film is undoubtedly a very charming science fiction masterpiece, the Grand Dune universe. It constructed the magnificent landscape of yellow sand filling the sky, and mysterious elements such as the unpredictable sandworms brought a shocking visual impact to the audience. In terms of the plot, Paul struggled between revenge and fate. His emotional entanglement with Chani was delicate and touching. The power struggle was thrilling. The film also deeply explored human nature, power, and belief. The process of Paul becoming the savior revealed the helplessness of being caught up in power. However, for the audience who haven't seen the previous works or the original book, some plots are a bit obscure, and the narrative rhythm is a bit slow. Overall, the film, with its unique charm, has added a brilliant touch to the history of science fiction films. Friends who are interested can watch the original film Dune, Part 2. If you like this video, you might as well like, comment, and subscribe. More wonderful films. Let's meet in the next video.